Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, for the next half an hour, we're going to be focusing on Europe. We'll bring you the latest on the Brexit negotiations, President Macron's vision for the EU, and does the European Union want to build a military-grade laser? First, though, here's our guide to the latest from Europe in just 60 seconds.
There's been some uncharacteristically warm weather across Europe this week, but in Strasbourg things weren't so sunny for Martin Selmayr, top civil servant and former aide to Jean-Claude Juncker. The European Parliament called on the Commission to reassess its nomination process. At the same time, the Windrush fiasco in the UK led some MEPs to raise concerns about the registration of EU citizens after Brexit.
Certainly after the Windrush scandal in Britain, we want to be sure that the same is not happening to our European citizens.
There are more questions for politicians in Malta as 18 international news organisations came together to launch the Daphne project. It seeks to continue the work of investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was murdered last year. And could the Irish border be set to derail Brexit once again, with the EU already having said no to the UK's tentative proposals?
Well, let's pick up on the progress of the Brexit negotiations. We're joined now by the Telegraph's Europe editor Peter Foster and the Conservative MEP David Campbell-Bannerman. Welcome to both of you. Peter Foster, tell us about your story today. You've reported the Ireland Brexit proposal is in tatters. Downing Street disagrees.
Well, Downing Street is rather careful with its words. Downing Street says they can find a solution if all sides work together productively, and that's a big if. What we saw this week on Wednesday was the end of 5 rounds of technical negotiations after the European Council in March. And my story is essentially that the 2 options Theresa May put forward in the Mansion House speech have been rejected by the EU. The idea that we'll collect tariffs on behalf of the EU has been ruled out, and the idea that we can somehow avoid a hard border in Northern Ireland by using technical solutions and trusted trader schemes. So in that sense, it's back to the drawing board for the Brits. Doesn't mean there aren't any solutions, but the ones that Mrs May advanced in the Mansion House speech are looking extremely shaky.
Right. Do you accept that those 2 proposals from Theresa May have pretty well been eliminated?
I think the customs partnership, the sort of the bigger picture stuff, that is in difficulty. But I mean, the game plan on the technical side, I don't agree with that at all. I've done my own paper, and Lars Carlson, the EU's own advisor, has come up with a solution already. What the EU is doing, the game plan, is to use the Northern Ireland border issue to keep us locked in the customs union, because as Katja Adler has reported, they're terrified, in her words, of us being super competitive outside of the EU.
Right, but if they've rejected those 2 proposals and the UK government has signed up to the 3rd backstop solution, which is keeping certainly Northern Ireland in a customs union, if not the whole UK, what's the alternative for Theresa May?
Well, as I say, I think my research on a technical solution, you're not talking about Canada, US, you're not talking about 370 million, it's 6.5 million. There's more people that actually cross the Turkish EU border under a customs union, same customs union, twice as many cross the border than the entire population of Northern Ireland.
So you still think the technical solution is viable?
Absolutely.
What do you say to that? I mean, where does it leave the negotiations?
It leaves Mrs May trying to square a triangle. You know, she's made 3 promises that there won't be a hard border in Northern Ireland, there won't be a border in the Irish Sea, and she will leave the customs union. The truth is that only 2 of those promises can hold true at any one time. Now, I think technical solutions could have a role to play, but what's clear from, if you read my story, from what's coming out of Brussels, is that technical solutions can have a role to play at the margin. But in order to get there, the starting point is that we join the customs union. Michel Barnier has said that himself. A very senior Irish diplomat said to me, the customs union doesn't fix everything, but without it you can't fix anything. the next step of that question is the EU are also clear that the customs union doesn't fix everything and that you're going to need high levels of alignment. And this is why it's so toxic for Brexiteers, for David Davis, because actually to get to a world where those technical fixes work, you end up pretty close to Brexit in name only.
Will we be in the customs union in all but name?
Well, we've got to avoid that because, you know, the customs union has 20,000 tariffs, and I'm amazed, to be honest, at Labour actually supporting the customs union. You know, you're talking about hurting the poor, 60% tariffs on shoes, you know, on meats, on apparel.
But with this border issue in Ireland, will Britain have to stay in the customs union?
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, as I say, their own advisor has a solution to it now.
Right, but it's being rejected by the EU. Where does it go? Where does it go from here, Polly? Do you think at this point that Theresa May, even though she has categorically said and promised that Britain will not be in the customs union, that she's really going to renege on that?
Well, it's been put perfectly. She's having to renege all the time because she made red lines that were contradictory. I mean, she, you know, exactly as you say, an impossible triangle. My hunch is that we will end up in something so like the customs union. It may not quite be called the customs union, because in the end, that's what suits us. The fantasy of all this trade elsewhere compared with the tariffs and the barriers that will be put up against us if we don't are just so daunting as one industry after another discovers what's about to hit them, including even, ironically, the fishing industry, who wouldn't be able to sell their fish if there was no deal and there was no proper customs union.
Do you agree that that is now a more likely scenario for the government to agree to?
Not at all.
Why?
Because, look, even the EU now, their official position is basically CETA++, if you put it that way. They've given ground on services, they'll offer us services, we'll have 100% tariff-free, 100% quota-free deal. That's where we're at. They've agreed that. Because we import so much more, we will be their largest customer outside of the EU.
All right, well, let's, though, get back to the negotiations. Michel Barnier, according to you, has announced that the talks are going to pause until the Northern Ireland issue is resolved. Is that right?
Not precisely, actually. What I say in my report is that Michel Barnier has ended the internal scoping process of the EU. So the discussion in the EU about what the future looks like has essentially reached a pause because there isn't much else to talk about. Until the Brits come forward with a workable solution, you can't really get into a serious discussion about what the future is going to look like. So what that speaks to the fact is that if we don't get a deal on Ireland by June, you're going to be looking at an increasingly flimsy document, non-binding trade document, to go with the withdrawal agreement in October.
Right. Do you agree time's running out?
Well, the pressure is on, but no, the point is we don't have any tariffs. You don't have any, you know, the point about negotiations is it's all about getting rid of tariffs. We don't have any tariffs to get rid of. We don't have any quotas to get rid of.
What makes you think the EU is going to do an about turn on this issue on Northern Ireland?
It's putting pressure on because its preferred policy is to force us staying in the customs union, but that is absolutely ridiculous. Not our policy. The policy hasn't changed.
But it's not just pressure from the EU, is it? It's pressure here too. I mean, the House of Lords, as you know, defeated the government as part of the EU withdrawal bill. How much do you blame your Tory colleagues in the Lords?
Well, I think their vote was absolutely shameful. I mean, here you have a very privileged group of people forcing the poor to be hurt more by their 20,000
Oh, that's absolute nonsense. The idea that the Conservative Party and the Brexiteers are standing here for the poor, I think probably...
No, sorry, the customs union.
Well, let's not have a battle about who's spoken more to the poor, but carry on. Carry on what you were saying, Polly.
I mean, this is realms of unreality. We're going to get everything we want and we don't have to give anything away instead. What alarms me most of all about the Irish border, though, is that I hear a number of Conservatives, including Boris Johnson, suddenly saying, well, you know, the Good Friday Agreement, it's time we renegotiated, rethought it. And you think, right, are they really willing to make that sacrifice? Over 3,000 people killed, and they're willing to go back to those days. I think any undermining of the Good Friday Agreement, particularly as things are very tense in Northern Ireland now anyway, with no government in power, is very alarming.
How dangerous is this moment, Camilla, for Theresa May?
The only people who would be undermining the Good Friday Agreement would be the EU if they force a hard border on Northern Ireland. The EU has said it doesn't want it, Britain has said it doesn't want it, and Ireland has said it doesn't want it. And actually, this is a negotiation, so the government does have another strategy. I'm not advocating it, but the Brexiteers will say no deal. Right. That leaves two problems. First of all, it leaves a massive problem for Ireland, because if Ireland has the common external tariff slapped on it, it will have tariffs on its beef and it will go bankrupt. Second of all, if we withdraw the £40 billion pot of cash, the EU goes bankrupt. It'll have to turn around to all of the countries and say, could you give us a bit more, please, because we've just lost Britain's £40 billion.
But
that's a fairly good negotiation stance, one imagines.
Where we are now, though, Camilla, how much pressure is Theresa May under politically here? We've had the House of Lords defeat. We've had this motion that has been tabled by Tory rebels calling on the government to make being in an EU customs union a negotiating objective. How seriously should ministers take this?
Of course she's under political pressure, but she needs to also think about the public. The public voted for Brexit. The public doesn't advocate a peers against the people scenario, and the public doesn't also like this rhetoric about reversing Brexit. Brexit's happened. We mustn't lose sight of what the public wants in all this.
Nobody knows what the public voted for. They voted
the public
to be out.
knows exactly what they voted for, Polly, for goodness sake.
You don't speak for them any more than I do. We know they voted for out.
Nobody has changed their view. Any polling has suggested that the Brexit and Remain vote remains the same. So you haven't had a load of Brexiteers pulling their hair out going, I didn't vote for this, I didn't vote for this.
I agree.
So they did know what they were voting for.
Nobody knows what they think about the customs union. Nobody
knows. They haven't changed their mind.
Don't talk over each other. Polly, just end that point and then must come back to Peter.
I just say that, we know that we voted for out. I totally agree. People haven't changed their mind much about that.
They haven't.
But what out means is what all of this is about.
I think it's clear what out means now.
An out that really does us harm, or an out that minimal damage.
The frustrations that are being voiced over there, the problem is that the accident of history creates an external EU border in Ireland. Theresa May doesn't want to put a border in the Irish Sea, and she has a treaty obligation in the Good Friday Agreement not to undo the borderless arrangements of the Good Friday Agreement. So she cannot deliver on that for the frustrations, people who want to be out. She can't physically do that. And so, to David's point, if the Ireland thing didn't exist, we could be sitting here having a conversation about tariffs, about trade-offs, or whether we want to do rules of origin,
but
about that.
This is where the
conversation, because she doesn't want to break up the United Kingdom and she doesn't want to ruin the Good Friday Agreement.
So what's the solution in your mind for her?
She's in rocks and hard places. She has to join a customs union, because if you want an all-UK solution, right?
Because she doesn't want to break up the...
For the sake of argument, she joins the customs union, and then the devolved institutions in Northern Ireland say, OK, we'll be aligned on goods and agriculture. It doesn't solve the problem, because the chlorinated chicken, etc., that we might have done a deal with the Americans, it's still going to have to be policed in the Irish Sea border, and she can't sign up to that.
I was just going to say, as we sit here, we've got the Commonwealth down the road. They're talking about £700 billion of deals. We can't do our own trade deals. We stay in the customs union. I'm on the trade committee of the EU. They're not doing a great job. They haven't got one with China, with India, United States.
Thank you both for coming in. Now, French President Emmanuel Macron, remember him, did a star turn at the European Parliament this week, and Adam Fleming was there to watch it all.
Every month, a different EU leader has hit the red carpet here at the European Parliament to give a speech sketching out their vision for the continent. No offence to the Croatian Prime Minister or the leader of Portugal, but they didn't have people lining the balconies to get pictures. The man hailed as the saviour of the EU arrived to the sounds of the Marseillaise and the Ode to Joy. His not-so-humble mission, the reinvigoration of Europe's entire democracy.
A type of European civil war is reappearing, where our differences, sometimes our egoistic nationalism, seem more important than that which unites us in the face of the rest of the world, where our fascination with illiberalism grows every day.
And there were some policies among the poetry: a new fund for migrants, support for a tax on tech companies, and a call to agree a roadmap for reform of the Eurozone by the spring.
Before the end of this mandate, we must define a roadmap that allows us to advance step by step towards a banking union and the creation of a budget that allows for stability and convergence in the Eurozone.
He's still going. It's been about 3 hours now. The 3 hours and more of debate left MEPs thrilled. Well, most of them.
President's speech was impressive and very practical.
What do you think of the President's speech? Good. Was it a blockbuster?
Very good.
Oh, he's such a star. I mean, what can I say? I don't agree with his policies, but he's really got charisma.
He listened more than he spoke, and that's always a good thing in a politician.
Thumbs up from Macron?
Great.
Yeah, it was great.
Yes.
Fantastic.
I think he's really a visionary. He has a vision, and we have to support him.
He's rather smaller than I thought. A bit like the bull, I suppose.
The Messiah was on his way out of here. Next stop, a trip to Berlin to sell his plans for the euro to the sceptical Germans.
Risk on the one hand and responsibility on the other hand have to go together. We in Germany are against the mutualisation of national debts, and we are also not in favour of an own budget for the Eurozone. We would like to use the existing framework of the European institutions.
So there's a way to go to realise Macron's Euro vision. Next on the red carpet, the leaders of Belgium, Luxembourg, Poland, and in November, Angela Merkel.
So, Emmanuel Macron, feted as a hero by some MEPs. Polly, Tommy, his idea, which many will see as federalism, straightforwardly, that the Eurozone should come closer together, a banking union, a bigger budget, is it going to wash?
I don't think so. I think things are moving emotionally very much in the other direction. What we're seeing is a revival of nationalism. I don't think it's going to happen. And particularly as he's been very close to, the French have been very close to the Germans, but Angela Merkel's not having it. And in her new government, her new partners are not having it either. So, and the Germans are very worried at the idea that anybody else is going to control it, some central bank is going to control the finances. I don't think so. And I think he's going to be on his own. But huge support he'll get for the idea that Europe must remember its liberal heart, and at the moment it's letting the Poles, the Hungarians get away with things that are not basic human rights, that they've signed up to human rights to be members of Europe, and yet they're disobeying them on the distinction between keeping the laws, the law separate to the executive and so on. And I think he might get support for saying we've got to get tougher on those people who are not keeping to the broad principles.
Just broadly, Emmanuel Macron, are you a fan?
The jury's a bit out. I like the fact we were discussing just off air now that he answers a straight question with a straight answer, probably because he comes from a non-political background. I think he's playing an interesting game at the moment in that he is obviously pro the federalised European project, but also nationalistic about France. And we saw him aligning, of course, with Donald Trump recently over the Syria bombings and very much leading the way, which, of course, will have played very strongly to perhaps those... As Britain did, of course, and I'm not condemning him for that. I'm just saying that plays very interestingly into the hands of some of the people that might not have been his natural supporters. So he's sort of at the moment managing to have his gâteau and eat it, I think.
Right. I mean, he warned of a civil war in that speech unless countries shun nationalism, the sorts of things you were talking about, and rising authoritarianism in favour of a liberal democracy. But, you know, who's going to take lessons from Emmanuel Macron in Poland and Hungary or anywhere else at a time when they're being asked then to cede more sovereignty and Britain is busy leaving?
Well, I think that they will in the end, because I think that Europe's identity and its sense of itself is we are a beacon of democracy. Why do all migrants want to come to Europe? Because we are the safe place. We are the upholders of basic democratic...
But then why the rise of these nationalist populist
that's
parties
what's
within
so alarming.
So many EU countries, unless they're fed up with what's going on in the EU?
They are the ex-communist countries, and perhaps they've never quite absorbed the full message of democratic...
Let's not conflate Europe with the EU. Lots of people find the EU as a political construct anathema, but would think that places like Italy and France and Germany and indeed Britain are wonderful. So it's a turning of the tide against the political construct of the EU, both in Britain and other countries. Not necessarily, of course, migrants want to come to Europe because Europe's great.
Right, but what about looking ahead? I mean, do you support the idea of a much closer Eurozone, Britain obviously outside, but a much closer Eurozone? Would that be good for Britain, a federalist structure, the shared sort of budgets and banking unions, even more than they have now?
Well, if the EU doesn't collapse, it's going to be in that kind of format anyway. Whether it gets ever closer or not is up to the EU. I think the EU itself is going to struggle with that because a lot of people heard Jean-Claude Juncker speak about increased federalisation, EU armies and all the rest of it, not least, funny enough, Ireland, and looked at it and thought, I don't know if we want to contribute to an EU army. Indeed, we're neutral and we've only got 5,000 troops on our own soil. So some of these plans are unfortunately opposed by people within the EU. So it doesn't really matter what Britain says.
Right, what about the phenomenon of a new centrist party here? Can the trick, may I call it that Macron pulled off, work here? Admittedly, different system, not presidential, but there's been lots of talk about it.
It's the different system that's the key. Nobody can break through our system. Our system is utterly rigid and keeps all newcomers out. So, you ask UKIP, what happened to them? You can do tremendously well and be absolutely slaughtered by our first past the post electoral system. In a presidential system, you can have somebody, it's very difficult. I mean, what he did was amazing. But also, we haven't got anybody. Where is our Macron? Where is our...
Well, there has been a suggestion that Arsene Wenger, now he's leaving Arsenal, that he could be the person to lead the new centrist party.
People might see him as a Corbynista, of course, because Jeremy Corbyn's a massive Arsenal fan. And what's interesting as well about the whole progressive party movement is, on one hand, you have the Love film guy with 50 million, but no MPs supporting it. On the other hand, you have the Amuna and Soubry alliance, which might have 11, 12, 13 Labour MPs, and they don't have any money. So surely this whole progressive movement needs to become as one.
They are not going to be
happen or not?
Absolutely not. Amuna and Soubry totally aligned on Europe, but just think of all the things that Soubry has voted for in terms of the austerity, what's happening, what we've seen happening to councils in your programme today. I don't think there's any meeting of the minds between Labour and Tory except the group about Europe.
All right, let's leave it there, ladies. Enough chat about Emmanuel Macron and centrist parties. Now, lasers may seem the stuff of Star Wars, but the European Union is asking for bids from defence companies to build a new, high-powered laser weapon. The plan is to build a prototype similar to the one seen here, being developed by the US Navy, which could take out things like drones and missiles. The UK is also developing a weapon, and Brussels is said to be worried that they will have to rely on non-EU technology after Brexit. The plans have led to some in the tabloid press claiming there could be a laser arms race between Britain and Europe. Here to hopefully bring some light on the subject is Justin Bronk, who's a military technology expert at the think tank Russie. So, how likely is it?
I think there's definitely going to be some form of laser arms race, but it will be between the United States and China. It's also worth remembering that lasers sound terribly sexy and cool. I mean, everyone's seen a lot of Star Wars. They're undeniably futuristic. But actually, in terms of what they can be used for, they have a few niche applications where they're very effective, at least in theory, if you can get them to work at a high enough power level for long enough. But for most of the time, a missile or a shell from a cannon is going to be the more effective option. So they have a niche role.
Who's in favour of sort of driving this forward?
Certainly the United States Navy and the Royal Navy would love to be involved as well. The UK has its own programme, which we've christened Dragonfire. It's very St George-esque. But essentially, the problem with a laser is you need to have huge banks of capacitors, cooling, batteries, as well as a large power source of some kind. And that basically means they work quite well in theory for ships, but for something road mobile or let alone airborne, you're stuck with something quite low powered, so not very useful for the kind of things intercepting missiles, drones that people are talking about. So navies tend to be in favour. The Royal Navy, on the other hand, has a lot of other budgetary commitments which it is struggling to meet without laser weapons or anything else.
So you wouldn't be a fan of Britain or the EU spending money on this?
Fundamentally depends on what threat they want to be looking at. If we are in an era, as we seem to be, where state threats, and by that we mean Russia, because it's the only one that could conceivably pose a major geopolitical threat in military terms to European states, we have far more to do in terms of rebuilding stocks of basic things like spares, munitions, in order to be credibly able to fight a long war in terms of more than a few weeks against the Russians. Nobody ever starts a war if they think it's going to be long. As long as Russia thinks it can't win quickly, it won't fight. So that's all we need to do.
Have you taken the Jedi spirit a little too much to heart, do you think? The tabloids here talking about laser warfare.
Can't resist it. It's not just that, it's Bond, and it's also, of course, Austin Powers and his famous laser, which would threaten to cause some kind of apocalypse. It all sounds very technical, and I'm glad you've summarised it all, but it doesn't sound like it's going to be top of the list of the government's priorities right now.
Right.
That's the impression I'm getting.
There are other priorities that money should be spent on.
Armed forces in a desperate state, and he could list all the things they need, and most of all the Navy. But of the idea, the concept that there will be an arms race between Europe and Britain, if we get to that state of mind, then Brexit is not only an economic calamity, it is an utter calamity for our future.
Right, well, you've ended where you started there, Polly.
That's the spirit.
That's it. Thank you very much for coming in and explaining that to us. That's it for now. Thank you to all my guests.